This week we are welcoming Matt Payne to the podcast, and I'm delighted to be speaking with you today. Many of you will know Matt Payne from his own podcast, F-Stop, Collaborate and Listen. It's just nice to have him on the podcast to talk about his own work a little bit and some of his thoughts. Do you want us to get started by just letting us know a little bit about yourself? I think most people know you, but for those that don't.
Sure. Matt Payne. I live in a small little mountain town called Durango, Colorado, southwest corner, kind of close to Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. So I've got lots of beautiful landscapes within 3 or 4 hours of me, and kind of cut my teeth in landscape photography on a journey that I started in 2008, where I decided to climb the highest 100 mountains in Colorado. And the more and more I got into photography, the more I wanted to learn. And fast forward over a decade, and I'm super into nature and landscape photography. Been doing the podcast since 2017. Originally, I started my podcast as a means to just have conversations with other photographers, and it's definitely morphed over the years. It's a weekly show. As you probably know, it's really hard to keep a weekly show going, to produce content week after week, but I'm sure that's something we'll talk about.
Yeah, great. I'm really interested in how the podcast works in the overall look of what you do in your business, because you're full time now, aren't you?
Yeah, I went full time. I guess it's been 9 months ago now. I've been doing photography full time, and I would say the podcast is what keeps me busy when I'm not out teaching workshops for Munich workshops. I would say, gosh, I'm trying to do some math, but when you're not home all the time, which I was before, that means when I am home, I have to dedicate a lot of that time to actually making the podcast run smoothly, which, involves recruiting guests, emailing guests, coming up with content that I'm going to talk to guests about, and then producing the show, recording the show. So, it's probably at least 10 to 20 hours a week of work to keep it afloat, depending on how many glitches we run into.
Yeah, that's true, isn't it? So, in terms of your work, what does that consist of now? Is it workshops? Is it selling prints?
Yeah, so I'm in the field for Munich workshops between 70 and 100 days a year, which you tack on about 10 to 20% extra on top of that for travel. So, I'm away from home about 100 days a year. And then outside of that, I'm doing the podcast, which keeps me really busy because I'm also producing it for YouTube, which is a whole other beast. And then trying to sell prints on the side to pay the rest of my bills, things like that. So, and then of course, I've also got the Natural Landscape Photography Awards that I'm doing with Tim Parkin and Alex Nail and Rajesh Jyotiswaran that we've been doing. We're coming up on our 4th year now of doing that project. That also keeps me incredibly busy because I do all of the marketing and social media and book fulfillment for that project. So that is also a huge lift. Trying to think what else keeps me busy as a full-time photographer. Writing articles. I write for, On Landscape, Nature Photographers Network, my own blog, things like that. So yeah, you know how it is. Just
Yeah,
the 100 irons in the fire.
yeah. I know Tim. Tim's a friend of mine. He's in Glencoe, so sometimes I go over and swim with his wife, Charlotte. So lovely, and I love the concept of their awards. Can't believe it's 4 years though.
We just wrapped up year 3 and we're ramping up year 4 already. So
That's great. So you've got lots of things going on, haven't you? And do you think that sort of motivates you, or does the business side of it, does it distract you from your landscape work, or do you just thrive on it? Sometimes I complain a little bit, like I was complaining the other day about having to do some marketing or something. And then I was going, yeah, but actually I get to stay at home and then I get to go to lead some workshops. And this is a dream for some people, isn't it?
it is. I mean, obviously, the ideal world would be my wife would be my sugar mama. I wouldn't have to worry about teaching workshops. I wouldn't have to, worry about monetizing a podcast or
Yeah.
selling prints. But I do actually really enjoy it. And I would say even if I didn't have to make money on photography, I would want to, because as you said, it motivates you. I don't know, maybe it's a little strange, but it helps me stay on top of industry trends, and it excites me in terms of making my own photography better. And I don't know, it keeps you engaged intellectually, and you
Yeah.
know, keeps that side of your brain going. Whereas I feel like if I didn't have those things driving the photography, I would just be super lazy. Not that I'm a lazy person. I think I'm the opposite of a lazy person,
Yeah.
but I feel like, you know, if I didn't have those financial demands on me, I
Yeah.
probably would be pretty happy only going on a couple trips a year. And I don't know, I'd get
Yeah.
fat, and I don't know. I just feel like there's a lot of good things that come from having a busy work schedule. So
Yeah, no, I understand that totally. I think, sometimes you do sort of think it would be nice to take it a bit easier and just to do a little bit of work now and then whenever you wanted to, you felt like going out. But actually, I think there's something in being driven because you have to earn an income from it. So you're quite driven. So therefore you do more. And actually, it's not necessarily always a bad thing because it does keep you on your toes and it keeps you motivated, doesn't it?
yeah, and you know, one of my favorite books in college is a book by Viktor Frankl called Man's Search for Meaning. And it's all about existentialism and his experience as a psychiatrist, a Jewish psychiatrist who was put in concentration camps. And basically, the whole premise of the book is that our existence as humans is all about trying to find our what is our purpose in life, right? What can we contribute to this world while we're here? And I feel like in photography, there's so many different ways to do that. You know, even if you're just creating quote unquote beautiful photographs of beautiful locations or moments, you know, those still have the power to transport viewers to those things, to experience beauty. I think beauty is underrated a little bit in the art world. You know, photography gets a little bit of a bad rap, especially landscape photography, in terms of, oh, it's just photos of pretty things. It's like, yeah, what's the problem with that? You know, so
Yeah.
I think finding our meaning and our purpose, that helps also keep me motivated. My problem is I have about 900 ideas of what I
Yeah.
want to do, and probably the only half the time I need in order to accomplish them. So that's my biggest challenge.
I understand that. I'm the same with the ideas. They sort of, I don't know, they evolve as well. So, I think it's a good thing to have all those ideas, but then to think, well, okay, but maybe that's going to come in a few years' time, but we'll start working on it now gently. Just going back to what you said there, if I was to ask you, have you found your purpose? How would you answer that?
Ooh, I love this question. Well, it's always evolving, right? I feel like one of my main purposes now that I've come to embrace is being a thought leader in nature and landscape photography that people look up to. I'm not necessarily saying that like I have all the right answers, but I feel like I've been in the game long enough and have forged my own strong opinions that I have something to offer there. And then I also strongly embrace my role as being someone who helps to promote other people in photography, other people in landscape and nature photography. I get a lot of joy out of helping elevate work that I
Yeah.
personally find interesting or that I find beautiful or maybe unique, different. So, you know, I'm writing a monthly column for On Landscape. I've been doing that for several years now, where basically what I do is I just ask someone if they want to be a part of it. They send me a bunch of photographs. I look at their photographs, I look at their website, I learn a little bit about that person, and then I try to distill what it is about their photography and them as a person that makes them a
Yeah.
little bit unique or interesting, and hopefully kind of tie in a couple of concepts or ideas that might provide value to other photographers. But the main purpose there for me is just to, hey, here's a good photographer that you guys should check out, you know? So, and I love doing that.
Do you know, that is just wonderful to hear, and it's actually completely, as you were saying it, it's bang on the mark as to what I feel from you and have felt from you for many years, actually, because you interviewed me quite a while ago, actually. And every time I hear your voice, you've got a lovely, gentle voice, but it's very welcoming and you're respectful and you have this sort of humility as well and this desire to uplift people. And that's what I get from you. And those are the sort of people that I personally want to be around, because I think that we need more people like that in the world where we're going, look at this other person. Aren't they great? And I've got the ability to put a little spotlight on that person. So you can do it. I just think that's fabulous. I really do, Matt. I think it's brilliant that you're doing that and you're doing it well and you're doing it genuinely. So thank you for that.
No, thank you. That is kind of a through line though in a lot of the work that I'm involved in terms of, you know, the Natural Landscape Photography Awards. That was kind of born out of a mutual frustration from Tim and Alex and I in terms of where landscape photography was heading and the types of images and photographers that were being elevated, not necessarily aligning with our values or the things that we found interesting or cool to look at. So we wanted to create a platform where we could uplift those voices that we felt like were being drowned out by social media and by just current trends and how people edit photos and whatnot. So that's been a really fun project to work on as well. And then obviously in the podcast, it's great to be able to have conversations. I will tell you a secret though, Margaret, and I didn't set out with this intent with when I created the podcast, but I've spent a lot of time reflecting on it. The podcast and the competition have given me kind of a hidden little masterclass in nature and landscape photography. I mean, I have these incredible conversations with some of the brightest and most brilliant minds in our field. And I feel like I've got like a PhD degree in nature photography because of that. And I've gotten it for free because I'm having these conversations. So it's not all a bad thing. I mean, it's a lot of work, but I get so much out of having those conversations.
I was going to ask you that as well. What do you think you personally get from running your podcast? I think when I'm thinking about my podcast, I always feel uplifted when I'm speaking to the right people. I feel kind of like motivated. I learn things, or I just feel like, yeah, I just feel great. After making these connections and hearing these stories that you learn, don't you? If you can learn and you can listen, it's a great way of evolving your own work and your own world as well.
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's not just in terms of how we make photographs. I mean, it touches on so many different aspects
Yeah.
of being a photographer in terms of finding interesting subjects or learning about how to talk about our photography or how to sell our photography or how to market ourselves or the list goes on and on and on, and it's just having those conversations with so many amazing people. I've been able to get so many great ideas and use them to improve myself as well. So,
Yeah.
and then hopefully the idea is that the listeners get to reap those benefits as well.
So, are there any? I'm going to put you on the spot here. Are there any particular podcast episodes that or people that you've interviewed that stand out to you in terms of having brought up a particular subject that has taught you something? Maybe.
Oh man, gosh, there's so many. I
Yeah.
mean, one that comes to mind recently, I had Hans Gunnar Aslickson on my podcast, and in my opinion, he's really, really good at understanding color theory and design. And so I've been trying to incorporate a little bit more mindfully that approach to finding images in the field. So that's been impactful for me. On the business side of things, I've had so many great photographers on that talk about their process for working on a project. Alex Nail talked about his most recent book, The Great Wilderness. It was really interesting to hear him talk about his approach to creating the work that went into that book. I long time ago I had a really really impactful conversation with Brooks Jensen. He runs a Lenswork magazine, and just a really fascinating conversation with him in terms of just a more personal approach to making photography and you know having an understanding of what you actually want your photography to do and say. And then along those same lines, I had a fantastic conversation with Sean Tucker at the start of last summer. And actually, what came out of that conversation for me was a very focused and intentful approach to how I did my 35-day through hike on the Colorado Trail in terms of making it more than just a hike. I wanted it to also be a time for me to reflect on myself, reflect on my journey as a photographer, and hopefully come up with some ideas that I could use for a future book project, things like that. So those are just a few examples. I mean, there's been hundreds of others.
Yeah, that's a really diverse examples, aren't there? I listened to the Sean Tucker one actually, and he always makes you think.
And I love those episodes that are like, oh, I didn't think of that way. That's the best.
Yeah, yeah, it's really, really good. There's actually one that stands out in my mind of yours, and it's something that I've remembered all these years. I don't know how many years ago it was, but you did a podcast on women in landscape photography with there was four ladies, wasn't there? And you see, or was it three? So
I
you had, I
think it
don't
was
know.
like 7
Oh,
women.
was it?
Yeah.
Oh, was it? Right.
It was like 7 women and me. It was like Sarah Marino,
Yeah.
Jennifer Renwick,
Yeah.
Verena Patel, Anna Morgan. I mean, the list goes on. It was awesome. Yeah.
That's great. I don't know how you did that, like technically, but it worked. And I think the thing that struck me about that was that's probably the first time that I've heard a conversation like that about women in the landscape. And I thought it was brilliant, absolutely brilliant to get that out there, basically. And the way that you held it was just superb. I think it was just a brilliant episode. If anybody wants to listen to that, go back. I would say go back and listen to that one. I've never forgotten you since that one. So it's funny, isn't it, how some things just stand out in your mind.
Yeah, that was definitely one of my favorite ones to produce. I think I had tried to get part of it out of my memory just because, as you mentioned, the logistical challenges of organizing and producing that episode were definitely somewhere on the scale of nightmare. But to your point, one of the things I love about doing a podcast is that as hot topics emerge or as you notice certain things people are complaining about in the community, that's an opportunity to approach it from a more logical and reasonable standpoint in terms of having a conversation about it that's not just people throwing mud at each other on social media. Like, let's sit down and actually have a nice professional conversation that's authentic, that takes into account lots of viewpoints, tease out some of that nuance, and give the listeners a little bit more to chew on in terms of maybe what are some of the different aspects of how to think about a particular topic. So I've done a few of those panel conversations. I want to do more of them, but they are challenging to organize.
I can't even imagine, so I'm not going to go there personally. I quite like this when I do solo episodes. It's very simple, you just sit down and record.
It is a lot easier.
Yeah, it is. But touching on that, actually, just before we started recording, you just, I don't know what we were talking about. You said something. I think I was talking about producing podcasts and how hard it was. Perfect is the enemy of good enough. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that and how that works in your life?
Yeah, well, that definitely was born out of my career in the nonprofit sector, working in community mental health, and then later on working with adults with developmental disabilities. Those are both very highly regulated fields where there's a lot of things outside of your control, especially in
Yeah.
management. You've got staffing issues, you've got all of these rules and regulations that don't fit neatly into the box of reality in terms of working with people. And so, if you try to be perfect in that field, you will quickly find that it's impossible. But not only impossible, you'll just burn out very quickly. So, fairly early on in my career, I embraced that idea of, that perfection is the enemy of good enough. And I've kind of taken that into my own approach to all kinds of stuff for, not always for the best results, but I take that approach in my own editing of my photographs. I take that approach in how I edit podcasts or videos.
Yeah.
I've just gotten to the point where if it's perfect, you would never finish, right? Like, you would be polishing a podcast episode for, 700 hours. You would never release it. And you could only produce like one a year or something like that. I've personally found that that kind of mantra is also really helpful in terms of giving yourself permission to fail a little bit, and it helps with your mental health. I have a lot of people that I'm friends with in landscape photography that are constantly asking me, like, how do you get so much stuff done? You do NLPA, you do your podcast, you do YouTube stuff, you're writing books and blah, 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 blah. How do you do all that? And you were working a full-time job too. It's because I don't let perfectionism stand in the way of getting stuff done. And sometimes, the end product isn't perfect, but I'm still proud of what I produce, and I think it still provides value. And so for me, it's as long as those values are instilled in the end product, I'm pretty happy with it.
Yeah, I love it. It's probably the most important thing for everybody, I think, is to understand that perfectionism is something that holds us back and doesn't, and this fear of failure stops us starting, even, doesn't it? So I remember when I started my podcast, I was like, well, I don't know, I can't talk. I can't talk about photography. And I was like, well, I'll just give it a try. And then it was like, I don't know the tech. I'll just try. I'll just plug some things in. And, it wasn't great to start, but things evolve then, don't they? They get better. And it's the same thing with photography as well. You have to do the work, you have to do the art for it to get better. Otherwise, if you don't start because you're worried about failing, you're not going to get better, are you?
Right. I mean, I look back at photos I made 4 years ago, 8 years ago, 12 years ago. They've gotten better since then, right? And that's part of the process. But if I would have been a perfectionist from the very beginning, I would have never created a single photograph. So, same with the podcast. I mean, the first year of the podcast, lots of audio issues, lots of me stumbling around with my words, but I grew as a interviewer. I got better at talking. I got better at thinking about more interesting questions to ask, blah
Yeah.
blah blah blah. So, you have to just give yourself permission to fail, and then be easier on yourself, and then more importantly, look back on the things that you've created and start to identify some of your areas where you can improve it. Take small bites, improve it slowly over time. One of the things I'm always telling people that are like, "Oh, how do you make it in landscape photography? Or how do you do full time?" It's like it's a long game, and you need to be patient, and you need to be easy on yourself, and not get caught up in all of the shoulds and woulds. Give yourself permission to take your time and to make mistakes and fail.
Yeah, it's super important, isn't it? And I think it's really good to talk about this because I think it's really nice for the listeners to hear this kind of thing. I'm really, really interested in the concepts and the ideas and the things that we can do for ourselves to work on ourselves to be better photographers, rather than the f stops or the camera gear, which probably we won't talk about because it's not what makes you a better photographer, is it?
No, no, I mean, it's foundational, that kind of stuff,
Yeah,
but that's like,
yeah,
that's like the wheels on the ground. Like, it's not any of the engine, it's not the transmission. It's like such a small part of what makes a good photograph or of an outstanding photographer. And I mean, not to make it simple, but I think if you want to become a better photographer, you should become a more interesting person, which can take on all kinds of different approaches. But, read books, listen to podcasts, watch videos, watch movies, appreciate other art forms, study about the natural environment, study natural history, be curious, satiate that curiosity through books and learning. And I think most importantly, work on yourself. How can you become a better person? How can you treat the people around you better? What are some of the things that maybe you're not super proud of that you can improve, and the way you are as a human being? None of us are perfect. I know I'm not perfect. and and then the next level of that for me is starting to think about, okay, what do I want my photography to actually do and say and be
yeah,
about? How do I instill all of those things who make me me into those images and into my work? And for me, that's the most scary part of photography, and also the most exciting part, because it gives you so much to look forward to, but it's also incredibly overwhelming and daunting in terms of all the different directions that can take. So, and I'm
yeah.
still chiseling away at that myself.
Yeah, we're always evolving, aren't we? As long as you're constantly working and thinking about these things, you are going to get better. You are going to move forwards. So, when did you go on this long hike? Tell us about that and why did you do that?
This was August of last summer, so August 2023. Basically, what happened was I finally got this opportunity to work full time for Munch Workshops, which is a much more flexible schedule than working a traditional 9 to 5. And I thought to myself when that opportunity came up, wow, I have all of this time. Like, sometimes you have up to a month and a half that you're not doing anything, relatively speaking, meaning you don't have to go to
Not
work.
do
And I thought to myself, what's something I've always wanted to do, that now that I have the time to do it, what would I want to do? And I've always wanted to do the Colorado Trail. It's a 500-mile hike through the mountains of Colorado that starts in Denver, and it literally ends on the street that I live on in Durango. So it was like I got dropped off in Denver, and I walked home for 500 miles, and it was a really fantastic experience, and it definitely challenged me physically, mentally, emotionally. I was away from my family for 35 days. I can't remember the exact statistics, but it was like over 100,000 feet in elevation gain total. I climbed 30 mountains on the way. I took thousands of photographs. So I took all my photography gear with me as well, which was super fun. And I decided I wanted to spend the time on the trail just kind of pontificating about life and about myself and about everything. Now, I mean, it was like a transition for me. I was going from this nonprofit life of working full time to becoming a full time photographer. And so that was a huge kind of seminal moment for me. And I wanted to use that time to kind of reflect on that shift for me in my life. And so pretty much every day I would spend time just being receptive to nature, writing down different ideas that would just come to me, kind of like what we talked about with the Sean Tucker episode. And then every night I would record a little video about the things that I thought about, my experience that day. I haven't done anything with those videos quite yet, mostly because a lot of the content that came out of that experience, I'm thinking, well, not thinking about, I'm going to put it into a book of some kind. So I don't know what the book's going to be called. I know that it's going to be more of, I don't know if you're familiar with Guy Tall's More Than
Yeah.
a Rock book.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's kind of more that style of book, like essays relating to photography and life and art with some photography sprinkled in. That's kind of more the idea that I have for the book, but more from an authentic and personal side of just my own experiences. And we'll see where that takes me. So that was the Colorado Trail hike. That's what it was about, and it was pretty incredible.
That's brilliant. Everyone's got different lives, and we can do these things in different formats, can't we? We can't all take a month, but some of us can. But even if it's a week or a weekend or an afternoon, the value in taking that time alone away from the home, it comes back to you, doesn't it? You reap those rewards for years. I think I really believe in something, especially like the walking. And there's a lot of people that have done that, like there's a lot of famous things like Wild, Cheryl Strayed. That's now it's a film, isn't it, as well? When you're by yourself, but you're walking in the landscape, and this time to reflect is so valuable. I think it's just a brilliant thing to do. Those are the things that'll move you forwards, won't they?
It's interesting because when you're doing a hike like that, it strips away all of those external kind of noisy things like,
Yeah.
oh, I have to post on social media or I have to get this thing done or I have to do that thing. And you're just focused on your health for the day and how much food you're eating, how much water you're drinking, where you're going to get your next drink of water, where are you going to sleep that night. And once it gets distilled down to those very basic human needs, it opens up this entire, I don't want to say chasm, but it's like, wow, here's a whole part of my brain that's been completely unattended that I need to start gardening a little bit, you know?
I think it's really healthy. I do something every year. I choose one thing every year. I've been doing it for quite a long time, and it can be quite a big trip. It can be whatever it is, whatever is right for me in that year, and I'll just make sure I do it regardless of everything else that's going on in life, and even if it's really busy or whatever, it doesn't matter. It's no excuses. And actually, in March, I'm going to India for 2 weeks, but I know that time will, as you say, open up those bits of the brain that's been sort of like lying dormant because you've got your to-do list and you're busy and everything. So I just think it's really important, and I think that's why photographers should consider doing these things. They can be related to photography. So they could be a retreat or a workshop. This is slightly different. You're around different people, but when you do it alone, it's a different thing as well, isn't it? So there's those two different. But I think it's really important to think about consciously what you're doing with your year and your time. I don't think people think consciously enough sometimes.
Yeah, that was one of my biggest takeaways from the experience was just how much time we spend doing stuff that doesn't really add value to our experience on our short time on this planet. And we get wrapped up in all of these commercialized, idealized versions of what life should be like based on being fed all this marketing constantly, and it's easy to get sucked back into that stuff. But I'm constantly reminding myself of the kind of the things that I experienced and kind of had all these aha moments along the trail. And I'm super hungry to get back out there and do something similar again. I mean, it's been October, November, like 6 months now already, and I haven't even talked to my wife about this, but I would love to do, even if it was like a 2 week thing. Just let me go again. Like, I promise I'll come home. That's the hard part, is like, how do you convince all the
Yeah.
people that depend on you to give you that space? But I think it is worth it.
It's difficult, isn't it, family? Have you got children?
Yeah, I've got a 16-year-old son. Yeah.
Okay, and then you feel like you should be there for them. My kids have just left home last year. Oh, it was a year ago. I can't remember. And it was great when they left home because you sort of had one less thing that sort of was making me feel guilty at going, because they're off living their own lives now. But then you still have this feeling that you should be back home for the other people and your responsibilities, etc., etc. But we have to remember that looking after ourselves and our mental well-being and our learning is so much more valuable than we know, because we go back to your wife. This is how you can explain this. This is how you can explain it to your wife. You'll go back a better husband because you'll be more fulfilled. You'll be more happy. But it's true, isn't it? We've just got to remember that, I think, sometimes.
Yeah, and it's harder for me to relate that to her because she's not a big outdoors person.
Yeah.
So, it's like trying to explain to her, like, well, when you spend a bunch of time outside, it's actually really good for you. It's helpful. And she's like, okay, just rolls her eyes a little bit. But yeah, it's a tough sell for sure.
It's not easy. It's a balance in life, isn't it? So can you just talk to me a little bit about how you think that the sort of the social media side of things influences you? How do you manage that? Because I know we're talking about this balance and all these things that are going on. So I'm fascinated to hear other people's views on social media, whether that's a difficult thing for you, is it a big thing, or do you just kind of just treat it as just a little extra and you're not spending too much time on it?
Yeah, I've actually spent a lot of time thinking about this because I've found that my relationship with social media can be really toxic at times.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is about social media, but it somehow has the ability to tap into the very worst versions of who I am as a person, and it just lets it loose. And I don't know what it is, but I constantly find myself getting in trouble on social media. Anyways, like, I remember I did a 3 week trip in November, December, down to Antarctica, had almost no access to social media. And when I got back, it's when they opened the app Threads up to the Europe, and all these photographers were getting on Threads, and I was like, oh, I'm on Threads. I'll check it out. And I've spent all this time on Threads, and there was like a very direct correlation to the amount of time I was spending on the app to how badly I felt as a human being. I don't know what it was, but I couldn't get away from it because I was like, oh, I have to comment on that, and oh, I don't agree with that, and there's something about social media that just gets
Right.
me going. So I have to be really mindful about how much time I spend on it, what I do on it. I find that if I keep myself busy in creating things for social media and then putting it out there, maybe commenting a couple things here and there on the things that I produce, and maybe commenting on a couple things here and there on some of the things my friends put up, that's about the limit that I'm
Yeah.
giving myself in terms of spending the time, because otherwise it just I don't know what your experience is like, but for me, social media just it turns me into a very bad person.
I find that quite amusing, but I can understand it actually. But for me, it's the opposite. Actually, I really enjoy my social media, but I'm very kind of I'll post something and then stand back, and I'll interact with the people who are commenting, but I won't go anywhere else and really actively. I know you should, but I'm not going to do it. That's not something that I get drawn into very very easily. So Threads feels like another thing to spend your time on. I don't know when we're supposed to be actually taking photographs. So,
I
so
know.
I don't get it. I don't get it. So I'm conscious of the need to build and maintain a platform, and I enjoy making little videos, and I enjoy expressing myself on there. And I've built this lovely little community. It's quite small, but they're just lovely, and they make me feel really supported. genuinely as well. And maybe that's quite rare, I don't know. But I know when I was in Manchester having this awful time with my mum in hospital, there were so many people coming to me with such lovely comments and messages, and I just felt like there was this whole community there for me. So I don't know, is that unusual maybe?
I don't know. I know that when good things happen in my life and I share it, I get lots of positive
Yeah.
reactions for the most part. There's a few people that just have to go to their way to try to ruin your day and or make it about them instead of you, but that's a whole other topic. But yeah, I mean, I feel like social media is one of those things that you get out of it what you put into it. You know, if you're constantly putting it out into the social media world, like positive things that people get value out of, you're probably going to get some positivity back as well. And that's like another way I've tricked myself is when I'm starting to feel negative about social media,
Yeah.
I'll spend like, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes on my Instagram feed or something, and I'll just find 3 or 4 or 5 photos that I think are really interesting, and I'll just share them as a story and tell people why I like
Yeah.
them that aren't, of other people's photos.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, this is really what social media is about. It's
That's right.
appreciating what other people are doing and being excited about it. That's a good reminder for me is just try to stay positive.
And that takes us back to the beginning when we were saying about what you as a person and you as your work and what you do. And if it you go back to that, well, you're sharing and you're uplifting other people, you're putting spotlights on people who are doing amazing work and are presumably nice people and good at what they do. If you can then relate that into the social media side of things, I love doing that actually. And I keep forgetting to do that. Sometimes I'll do like a story thread and I'll say, here's some great people to follow, just quick highlights. And you come away feeling really good. You come away with this kind of like joy at sharing other people and they're appreciative to you. They're like, oh, thank you. And you've made somebody's day sometimes. So maybe we need to look at it a little bit more like that.
Oh, for sure. I mean, and there's lots of psychological science that supports why that's good for you. I mean, whenever you do something to help others, I mean, they talk about, buying someone a Christmas present. The reason why we do that is because it feels good to show someone that they're appreciated, right? So there's lots of positive psychological benefits to uplifting others, and there's not a whole lot you get out of doing the opposite.
No, that's true. I love that. That's what we should keep remembering, and it's something that's really important to me. Actually, I've only realised that recently how important it is to be around people like you that are saying this, that are uplifting, and they're not kind of like a lot of photographers can be like don't come in my patch, or I'm not going to mention that person because then they might get a little lift from that, or they're very protective. It can be like that, unfortunately. So the more people that I'm around that are like you, it's great.
Well, I mean, I will say that I'm not perfect. There's definitely things that just trigger me because it challenges my values or my belief systems and things like
Yeah.
that. And that's when I have to be careful because in the process of wanting to engage in an intellectual conversation about something, I tend to have very strong reactions and I get very verbose and that can be really turn people off, and if I'm not careful it can feel like I'm attacking them or being personally critical of them where I'm just trying to express my opinion
Yeah.
in an intellectual way, but I have to be careful about what that looks like sometimes. So
I think,
that's
yeah.
one of those. We were talking earlier about becoming a better version of yourself. That's something I've been working on since I was a little kid. So
Yeah, and it's great to be aware of that, isn't it? It's great to say, well, this I'm a bit like this. I'm working on doing this instead. I think that's a great thing. And talking of that, just touching on something, I read that you have a degree in psychology. Is that correct?
yeah, I've got a bachelor's in counseling and a master's in clinical psychology. Way back when I got my master's degree in 2003, I created and validated an anxiety detection measure for elderly adults, that's been published in the journal Anxiety.
Wow, I found that fascinating because I wondered how your experience in psychology, I suppose, translated into the photography.
Oh gosh, I mean, we could probably have a 2-hour conversation about
No.
the intersection of psychology and photography. For me, I guess starting off with the podcast, the reason why I got into psychology to begin with is that I found humans very fascinating, and I found the differences in all the different people that exist so fascinating and interesting. And then learning clinical skills to tease out some of what makes people interesting or unique is something that I've had to rely on heavily for the podcast. So that's been
Yeah. Yeah.
nice to be able to use some of those skills that I had to go to school for. But then maybe a more deeper level, I find that there's a lot of overlap with kind of the more personally expressive side of photography and psychology. So thinking about how spending time in nature and using your camera can help your mental health, or thinking about how we can use our artwork to process emotions or to process things that happen to us in our life. I find those intersections of psychology and photography to be really fascinating, and it's something I try to tease out in some of the podcast interviews that I do. Yeah, so I think that's the biggest crossover.
That is one of the other areas that's just really fascinating. I don't have a degree in psychology. I don't have anything in psychology, but I tend to like to read a lot of books around these subjects and learn, just keep learning on them, because I think it's just so valuable. And it's probably one of the areas that I'm most interested in now is, this idea of art therapy. So not necessarily photography, so any creative practice, how any creative practice is good for our well-being, and that mental or physical. So I think it's just so important for so many people.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I like about psychology is that it is a bit kind of hard to nail down in terms of how it applies to various aspects of our lives. And that's what gravitated me towards social psychology, which is kind of like the study of humans in groups, basically. And I really like thinking about social psychology as it relates to how photographers do what they do, whether that be things that you see people doing on social media, or how you see groups of photographers employing different methodologies for monetization, or some of those things. I like to try to take that twisted approach of trying to figure people out and then understand the motivation behind different behaviors we see in photography, and helps me understand that from my perspective. And I find that if I'm in the mindset of trying to understand others, it makes me a little bit more empathetic towards what I see people doing, and also helps me incorporate certain things into my approaches to photography. So it's been a fun marriage of concepts for sure.
I think it's something that should be talked about more. It'd be nice to hear more conversations around this. I have been trying to bring on guests who talk about well-being quite a bit, and I just think it's really important. And obviously that element of the psychology behind it is really interesting. Although I don't have the expertise in that, I think I think we're all human beings and we're all suffering in some ways, and some at some points in our lives. We all have these problems, and to be able to use art as an outlet, it's just incredible, isn't it? But maybe we have to start consciously thinking about that more. Do you think it is a conscious thing that we have to think about?
I think it's helpful to be a little bit more intentional and mindful about how we use art for ourselves. I think it helps you refine the types of things that you engage with in the landscape. Like if you're a nature photographer, that's going to help you determine the types of subjects you photograph. It'll help you have a better understanding of why you might gravitate towards one type of scene over
Yeah,
another. I mean, I know you do a ton of wave photography, and like kind of, I don't want to call it intentional camera movement, but it has like a softer
yeah,
feel where you're doing maybe some panning, and that's more the technical side of things. But I know that when I think of photographers who have an aesthetic that's well developed and probably linked to some of the things we're talking about, your name
yeah.
definitely comes to mind. And so I'm guessing that you've probably spent some time consciously thinking about what it is about those types of images that gravitates you towards them. So, yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's important.
Yeah, and I think what I'm trying to figure out here is, and I'm asking you as well, and you're making sense of it for me, is photographers that don't think deeper. And maybe that's just like early stages. Maybe when you get into it early, you're just going round to locations and taking pictures, but you're not thinking why or how they connect or why they connect to you and how they reflect you as a person. Do you think there's a lot of people out there that are sort of like on autopilot, just trying to take nice pictures and they're not really thinking any deeper?
This is something I've thought about a ton because it's something I personally struggle with a lot in my own approach to photography. Not to belabor the point, but I think it's important for me to share that, in my first probably 10 years of photography, it was very planning focused and very condition dependent. Like, oh, I have to go to this spot and get that photo with these conditions, right? And that's what a
Yeah,
landscape photographer does.
yeah,
And right, and that was my approach, which has nothing to do with who am I as a person, or how do these places make me feel, or how do these subjects help convey a different idea or think something that I want to say about myself or about the
yeah,
things that I'm photographing. And those are things that I desperately, desperately want to have more clarity around in my own photography, and that I'm constantly struggling with, mostly because I feel like I've set a high bar for what that looks like. And I don't necessarily know that I'm there yet. At least I don't feel like I'm there yet. And I want to be there. But that's also the fun of photography, is exploring that and try to make sense of that for yourself. So
yeah,
yes, I do think a lot of people are on autopilot. I mean, I think about myself when I'm out photographing now. Most of the time, my strategy is to go out with no expectations, no preconceived ideas. I'm not looking on it from a project perspective or ooh, I want to build a portfolio of trees. Like, I'm not thinking from that perspective. I'm going into beautiful places. I'm reacting to what I find, and I'm trying to make sense of it with the lens and showcasing what it is I found interesting about that subject. And then oftentimes I find later I'm making some of those connections, like,
yeah,
oh, like there's a metaphor here that I didn't see, or things like that. So I also, this is gonna sound weird, but you think about some of your favorite musicians or artists, and what makes their work so good or so interesting is that it was used as a mechanism to process grief, or to, they're addicted to drugs or alcohol, and or maybe they had a heartbreak or
yeah,
something, and they're
yeah,
trying to work through that through their artwork, right? Well, I think about myself, and like, I don't have that stuff necessarily that I'm trying to
yeah,
figure out, or
yeah.
you know what I mean? Like, I'm not like a
Yes,
struggling artist with these ideas that are tormenting me. I'm just a
yeah.
guy that loves being in nature and using a camera, and I love being out there. And so it's hard for me to make those kind
Yeah.
of higher level connections with my photography that I really appreciate in other people's work.
I totally get what you're saying there. And I've noticed this about myself, okay, is that in the height of emotions or in some of the awful things that have happened, that's when I'm creating the best work. That's when the emotions that they really are coming out. And the photography has moved on very quickly, or whatever it is. In the past few weeks, I've been painting like crazy person, but they're great. But they're a result of the distress. So you need some you need some distress in your life. but, but, but we can't. That's a joke. But it's quite interesting, that isn't it? So maybe it could be the other way as well. You're very appreciative of like beauty. It's the heights of emotion. So the height of emotion could also be beauty and gratitude and just as you say, going out and going, oh wow, this is incredible, and appreciating that. So it sounds like to me that's what it's like for you, that you just love being out there. And it's quite interesting that you've got all this understanding of other people and insights, and you're thinking consciously about things, yet you're struggling a little bit to piece it together.
Oh, all the time. I'm always like, oh, I really love the direction that person's going with their photography. I wish I could do that. But it is interesting
Yeah,
because so I just spent 2 weeks in Yellowstone in winter, and I had a one day in particular that was incredibly powerful for me. We were driving along this river, and on the other side of the river was a pack of wolves, which is like they're like 40 yards away. It's crazy close. And they had trapped a male bison in the river, and they basically were, hunting it. They're saying, hey, you're hurt and injured, and you're going to be our next meal. And so I got to spend 3 hours watching this super powerful thing of nature doing its thing. And I videoed it. And I was so excited to share this little video clip that I made. And I shared it on Facebook. And of course, all my photography friends were like, wow, that's amazing. You're so lucky. That's incredible. But then I had all of these other people come out of the woodwork talking about how they hated wolves and wolves are the devil. And I can't believe you filmed wolves killing a bison. You should be killed by wolves. You're a terrible human. I can't believe you didn't stop them. I mean, all of these emotional reactions to this powerful event that I witnessed. And it got me thinking about, okay, there's a story here, right? Like we have all of these people that love wolves, they love nature, and yeah, it's sad that you get to watch another animal die at the hands of another animal, but that's what is happening every day all around us in nature. And then to see the other side of the story of all these people who had these super hyper reactions, emotional reactions to that video. So it got me thinking about like, gosh, is there a way I could tell this story about these two conflicting ideas, and maybe I could do a documentary on that and interview people and try to get their perspectives? And then I'm thinking about, okay, but where am I gonna have time to do that? But I mean, that's a whole other thing that I would love to be able to do with my photography is like explore those ideas of the intersection of humans and nature and things like that. But again, it's ideas, time, money. It's maybe another lifetime. I don't know.
I think maybe it's just leaning into the things that you are really, really drawn to, isn't it? Maybe there's something in that ability to go to shut everything else out, because there's lots of things that you could do, isn't there? But if you can really like shut all the noise down and forget what everybody else is saying and just go, well, I really, really enjoyed, photographing those wolves or filming or whatever it is you're doing at the time, and just leaning right into that and just keeping going back to doing. That's how I did it. I just like, well, I thought, when I first started, I remember, I mean, it's years and years ago now, I thought you had to climb mountains to be a landscape photographer. And I don't like climbing mountains. I don't really do mountains. I do little ones maybe sometimes, but I think it's a bit of a waste of time because you could be using that time that you're climbing down by the water. So, but yeah, I used to think that, and then I started going, well, actually, I tried to start climbing a little bit, and then it's like, I'm getting up here, but I don't really like it up here, so I'll take the picture just because that's what you're supposed to do. But then I was like, when I was by the water, I was always happier. So, and then eventually over the years, I just went, well, I'll just be by the water then. I just keep doing that. It doesn't matter what anybody else is doing. I don't know where I was going with that, but I was just thinking that maybe it is leaning into really just listening deep inside yourself. What is it you enjoy in doing? What is it you're connecting to? And it's hard. It's hard to do that.
Yeah, that's something that I try to teach students is chase what everyone else is doing, like just because that's what you see on Instagram or those are the popular photos that get attention. Yeah, that's great. If you want to emulate others and copy people and, be known for images that everyone else has already taken, go for it. But I think if you want long-term enjoyment and success in photography, you need to really spend time whittling down the things that you're really excited about and just like you said, lean into it hard and focus your energy on the things that you love, that you enjoy, that bring you joy. And that's going to come through in the work. That's going to come through in how you talk about the photography. It's going to come through in how you create the photography. It's going to come through with your audience and other people who are into those things too. They're going to be drawn to it because it's authentic. It's you, right? So for me, that's a huge message that I wish more photographers would hear, and much earlier on in the process of becoming photographers.
I love it. I think that's a great one to end on. I think that just kind of sums it all up for me.
There you go.
It's just brilliant. Love it. I love this conversation. Thank you so much for joining me, Matt.